Jeff, I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit. There's a lot of kind of self-congratulatory stuff that goes on at these progressive conferences. I love it, but sometimes it makes for boring TV. So what do you say to people who are like, okay, like, you know, you guys are always making this point about media ownership and how it affects what people see on screen, but I don't buy it. I don't buy that, you know, the CEO of some huge, you know, conglomerate is like picking up the phone and telling some reporter on the 6 o'clock news, oh, don't do that story. Don't do the environmental story because, you know, we own stock in that company. I don't buy it. What would you say to that person?
Well, conglomerate ownership doesn't usually mean that the owner of a huge corporation calls up the lowly reporter. That's not how it works, but it works. The corporate influence is clear. As Phil Donahue was saying in the panel here at this conference, the decision to fire him and hire a raving racist Michael Savage from talk radio, a guy who makes Limbaugh look like a liberal, that decision was made at the highest levels. And when you fire Phil Donahue and then the memos leak out that show that it was purely political, everyone in the newsroom knows it. You don't have to put out a memo to each reporter saying we want you to rein in any skepticism about this impending invasion in Iraq. By firing Phil Donahue and everyone in the newsroom knowing why his show was terminated, it's just, it sends a huge, it's a sound that everyone in the room hears just by someone disappearing. There were a bunch of us that just quit going to work, and that's a very strong message to those who were still going to work. So it's not like a conspiracy that happens in a room. It happens out in the open. Certain people are hired, certain other people are fired. Management's will is clearly communicated to everyone involved. And I should say that at the time that the Donahue show was canceled and other people lost their jobs in the run-up to the Iraq War, it was the same time that the lobbyists for these few media conglomerates were going to the Bush administration with their hands out, saying we want the FCC rules changed. Now, it was communicated by management. We didn't know exactly what was motivating management's ridiculous orders to us to tone it down, rein in our skepticism, but we got those orders day after day, week after week. We kept hearing Phil Donahue's too combative. It can't be a liberal show. Every time you book one guest who's anti-war, we were ordered we had to book two that were pro-war. And so to those who believe that there aren't those orders, we got them. They aren't usually as fanatically delivered to us, to reporters, as they were to us during that period. But again, the main way that corporate management communicates its likes and dislikes is usually more subtle than that, just in hiring and firing. And this show continues, and this show gets taken off the air. It's pretty strong communication when that happens.
So just to be clear, you were told by news management that for every one liberal you had on the show, you had to have at least two conservatives.
The specific orders that we were given week after week in the last months of Donahue were that if we booked one anti-war guest, we had to book two pro-war. Two guests on the left, we had to book three on the right. At one meeting, a producer proposed booking Michael Moore as a guest, and she was told that for political balance, she would need three right-wingers. That meeting, there were at least 20 people in the room. This is not something that management can deny. These orders were given repeatedly. When people went against the orders and they put on a balanced debate, the next morning I witnessed in the MSNBC newsroom that producer being chewed out by one of the top management at the channel. And again, management, in those weird, unusual times of media crisis, like when a president is pushing a war without evidence, the orders become very, very clear. But that's not typical. Typically, it's much more subtle than that, but everyone gets the word. Like when Donahue was terminated, all of these people who are vindicated by events, they don't get rehired. Those of us who were correct in challenging the evidence of weapons of mass destruction, we didn't get rehired. but one of the most hawkish hosts on the channel. The only one who lost his show, he lost it because he got kicked upstairs. They turned him into the general manager of the network. Again, those kinds of choices are made by top corporate owners, and they speak volumes about what management wants and doesn't. Of course, the good news, as I've said at this conference, the only good news is there's often exceptions to the rule. And one exception today is Keith Olbermann. When we got terminated, Olbermann got a show, and he was not doing a hell of a lot with that show. He's described how he once booked Al Franken, and a couple days later, Janine Garofalo, and he was approached by management. Why all the liberals, Keith? He's told that story. But over years of struggle for the peace movement getting stronger and broader, the change in the political elections, Olbermann has more clout to get away with things that the same management didn't allow Donahue to get away with. So, I mean, the important thing is that when people out there hear those of us who are on the inside complaining about corporate ownership and dictates and bad choices, to every rule, there's an exception. And today the exception is Olbermann. He's an independent voice in cable news. He's getting bigger ratings. But I should say that when they terminated Phil Donahue, we were the most watched program on that channel. So ratings doesn't necessarily save you. What really saves you, and that's the importance of this media reform movement that's growing thanks to conferences like this. I wrote a column saying that if Keith Olbermann gets silenced and terminated, like Phil Donahue was, we should have demonstrations in the streets. I mean, it's understood that the media reform movement, the media activist movement, is so much stronger today in 2007 than it was when we were terminated 3 weeks before the Iraq invasion in February of 2003.
Do you think
is this stuff helpful? Or,
yeah,
I mean, you'll be able to pick and choose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you think that the disaster in Iraq has put a kind of fine point on what was previously an abstract concept for people, which is that bad media hurts real people?
Yeah, I think it's become pretty clear from the Iraq disaster how big a role the media play in our society. The media failed, and we are ending up in the Mesopotamia, the disaster in Iraq. It's obvious that the media failed. You hear the Iraq invasion called an intelligence failure, a political failure. Perhaps more than anything, it was a media failure, and it's widely understood. The problem is, while Keith Olbermann may be an exception, the experts that were totally wrong about Iraq are appearing on TV every day. They're now blowing smoke at Iran. They're the ones who get on the air and say how impossible it would be to withdraw troops from Iraq. Keith Olbermann may be an exception, but the general rule persists that the same experts that were completely wrong about Iraq are on the air. Phil Donahue, Jeff Cohen, we're off the air.
I may get the statistic a little bit wrong here, but I think it's fair to say that Fox News spent about a quarter or a third of what the other networks spent on its coverage of the Iraq War.
Yeah, I don't know.
And yet, actually, beat the other cable news networks in the rating
audience?
size.
Right.
And I'm wondering if we can just sort of use that to sort of, when people tend to think about bias in news, they tend to think about liberal versus conservative. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the kind of economic bias of, slashing funding
Right.
for investigation and research, and the way that has encouraged this kind of pundits in a studio, this kind of
Right.
stuff that's very, very cheap to
Right.
produce.
Yeah, I mean, I spent years at Fox News, and then I didn't last a full year at MSNBC, but I was working there 11-hour days. And I have a good understanding of what they want in management. They want stories that are cheap to cover. There's nothing cheaper than a tabloid trial, a sex scandal, a celebrity trial, celebrity not wearing her panties, and going out partying. I mean, that stuff is cheap. And if you can hook people on a prolonged tabloid scandal, then you get months of near free coverage, because you bring on the lawyers who just want to see their faces on TV, the former prosecutors and the current defense attorneys, and they can squabble for free for hours and fill up weeks and weeks of coverage. When we had a phony culprit in the John Bonet murder mystery that was 10 years old, saying he had done it, for 2 weeks, that's all they covered on cable news, was this John Mark Carr. They follow him in his airplane from Bangkok, Thailand, to California, to Colorado, and they treat him like he's a world historical figure, like Nelson Mandela getting out of prison, only bigger. And so, I mean, when you're working inside corporate media, you understand that there's certain stories that are free or cheap to cover, which is the tabloid fluff, the celebrity story, the crime trial. And there's other stuff that's expensive, and more than that, it might offend the powers that be. It might offend the government that you need to get the FCC to change the rules in your direction. It might offend a corporate sponsor who will flee. When you cover an O.J. Simpson case, or a runaway bride in Georgia, or a missing teen in Aruba, or a John Benet Ramsey case, you know that a commercial sponsor will never flee. It will be cheap to cover, and that's why it happens. There's no mystery why corporate media, especially TV news, are performing so badly. It's dollars and cents. And if you let a few corporations dominate the media system as we have in our country, then you're going to get this kind of a media. It's like, I mean, the people that own the media would much rather us be a nation of mindless consumers, easy targets for commercials, than informed active citizens. If we weren't informed active citizens, we might break up the media monopoly. So they have an interest in infantilizing the public. And again, from a dollar and cents perspective, there's nothing cheaper than tabloid coverage.
One of the things Free Press wants to, this is my last question, one of the things Free Press wants to encourage is, in 2007, is the FCC is going to be having hearings about their proposed regulatory changes. We want to encourage people to show up at those meetings. But what would you say to somebody who's like, A, that sounds boring as hell, I'd rather stay home and watch Jeopardy, and B, like, I mean, I kind of agree with you that, yeah, news is trashy and politicians lie. I mean, tell me something I don't know. Like, what can we really do about that?
Are you talking about hearings that are in local communities?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was one of the people that spoke at a hearing in upstate New York in the FDR estate. It was on the land, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's estate. And it was powerful. Everyone who was there was blown away to hear their neighbors giving different angles on what's wrong with the corporate media. I've been studying this for 20 years, and I learned things by hearing from people I'd never met who were in my community, who were giving vivid testimony to the FCC. I believe that this media issue hits people in their heart a lot stronger than others. People were complaining about Clear Channel, you know, one or two companies owning all the radio stations, and all the rock stations play the same music. And I mean, there's every different kind of complaint about corporate media content. And to see people in a room with FCC Commissioner Copps, Congressman Hinchy, and what we had in our hearing was Congressman-elect John Hall, who was a former rock star, talking about how corporate media affected him as a musician, as a working musician. So I just think that people really have things to say, and they have beefs about corporate media. And a lot of people have complaints about how public broadcasting in America is degenerated. It's timid, it's corporatized, it has the same experts and advocates over and over and over, just like commercial media, that it hasn't provided the alternative that it does in many other advanced industrial countries. So I think that it's easy to turn out the community. Our room was packed. And what's interesting is you get the local media to cover it. And the local media were there, and they covered it. Not as much as they should have, because it's corporatized media. But it was more coverage of media controversy and media content than I'd ever seen in my local community. So I think it's not hard to get people to come out. And you know what we tell activists and what Bob McChesney tells activists, if your main issue is feminism or your main issue is environmentalism or better schools or safer neighborhoods, your second issue should be media reform, because all those issues that matter to individuals and communities just don't get covered well in our conglomerated media. And so the number two issue for every activist has got to be media reform, and increasingly it's becoming that.